Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Department of English, Midnapore College, I heartily welcome you all to this ongoing online lecture series. This evening, we have with us an erudite academician, Professor Kalyan Kumar Das, as our speaker. But before Professor Kalyan Kumar Das starts with his lecture, I would like to formally introduce him to all our participants. Professor Kalyan Kumar Das is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Presidency University in Kolkata. He has been a visiting fellow at the Department of English, University of Delhi, and a visiting faculty at the Department of Comparative Indian Language and Literature, University of Calcutta. His present research work focuses on Indian philosophy, continental philosophy, the interactions between conservatism and liberalism, American pragmatist philosophy of John Dewey, philosophy of race, Dalit literature, philosophy of history, and Ambedkar's political philosophy. His research articles have been published in the Economic and Political Weekly and Dewey Studies. He has recently finished writing a research article on Ambedkar and Milsky for the journal Critical Philosophy of Race, published by Pennsylvania State University Press. Some of his other works on Dalit studies has also been published in Contemporary Voice of Dalit and Bangla Journal. He has also edited a special issue on Dalit studies of the journal Stronglap, Journal of Literary and Cultural Inquiry. He has also delivered lectures at the Center for Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, Jadavpur University, University of North Bengal, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, Kalyani University, Kavi Nazrul University, University of Delhi, Indian Institute of Technology at Kharagpur. And today he is going to deliver a very interesting talk on John Dewey and Ambedkar reflections on himsa ahimsa in the Mahabharata. But before I formally invite Professor Kalyan Kumar Das, I would like to just say that those participants who are just watching this lecture, who are willing to ask questions, they can write down those in the chat box or the comment box. And after the towards the end of the lecture, we will be giving those questions to Professor Kalyan Kumar Das, and he will be answering some of those. So now, without further ado, I would humbly like to request Professor Kalyan Kumar Das to please deliver his address. Over to you, Professor Kalyan Kumar Das.
Am I audible?
Uh, yes, you're.
Okay, okay. I'll go ahead then. Thank you. Thank you, Shangita and Tanmoy, for that introduction, and also for having me here this evening to deliver this talk. Um, I'm particularly indebted to the Department of English, Midnapore College. I have been there. That's my hometown, and it's always a pleasure to receive invitation from Midnapore College. Um, of 3 or 4 decades ago, some of my own relatives, including my father, studied in Midnapore College. So it's always a pleasure to receive invitation from the Department of English, Midnapore College. Um, so without wasting time, let me get into the topic that I'm going to explore in the next 50 to 60 minutes. This before I begin before I begin to give you an idea of what I'm going to do in the next 1 hour or so, let me talk about some biographical information that might help the audience to get the exact nuances that I'm going to explore, that I'm going to share with all of you. The connection between Ambedkar and Dewey is not merely a speculative one. It is based on an actual encounter between Dewey and Ambedkar as professor and student, respectively, at the Columbia University in the city of New York. From 1913 to 1916, Ambedkar was a direct student of John Dewey in Columbia University. If you look at the courses that Ambedkar attended in Columbia University, as a student of Columbia University, you will get to know that he attended courses on economics, on anthropology, courses on philosophy, um, and it is his courses on philosophy that led him to attend John Dewey's classes, because Dewey was a professor at Columbia around that time in the early years of 1910s. And so Ambedkar was a direct student of John Dewey, apart from being a student of other stalwarts like Seligman and others of that time in the United States academia. He was heavily influenced by Dewey, particularly by Dewey's thoughts in moral philosophy, Dewey's thoughts on democracy. If you look at most of Ambedkar's texts, you realize that Dewey is a very strong influence. But this also comes with a caveat. The caveat is that Ambedkar certainly was influenced by John Dewey's philosophy, particularly what people in philosophy discipline call pragmatist philosophy. Ambedkar was certainly influenced by that, but it's also true that Ambedkar was someone who got influenced by, or you can say interacted with, a wide spectrum of thinkers and philosophers. The list is almost endless. You can think of Indian philosophical schools like Mimamsa, Nyaya Vaisheshik, Shankho, Yog, Charbak, Advaita Vedanta. You can think of Indian philosophical different, and certainly Buddhism. You can think of all these Indian philosophical schools. Ambedkar was influenced by them. Ambedkar was interacting with them. Ambedkar was critiquing many of them. And at the same time, Ambedkar was tremendously influenced by a lot of Western thinkers. But Dewey certainly holds a very significant position there. If you look at Ambedkar's intellectual inheritances, Dewey is a strong, extremely strong influence, I would say. Whether we can directly, from this biographical note, whether we can directly derive an inference that Ambedkar was simply predominantly influenced by Dewey's pragmatist philosophy, then we might be mistaken. Because Ambedkar, you are dealing with, when it comes to Ambedkar, you are dealing with an extremely complex thinker who does not shy away from engaging with, in a very creative fashion, in extremely imaginative ways, with even his opposition's viewpoints. So it's a very complex intellectual firmament that you can imagine when you think of Ambedkar. So my suggestion is to not become reductive when it comes to thinking of Ambedkar's intellectual inheritances. That is the caveat, right? So when I discuss Ambedkar and Dewey, one immediate common sense inference that you can draw is that, oh, okay, so Dewey was a sustained influence was a very strong influence on Ambedkar's intellectual world. But at the same time, you must remember that it's not just that. In the sense that Ambedkar departed from many of Dewey's philosophical thoughts. You must remember the fact that Dewey, as a white academic in the United States academia, in the elite university space like that of Columbia University, was in a very different socio-political, cultural, intellectual position from that of Ambedkar, who was born in an untouchable caste community, Mahar, and then struggled a lot to get that kind of education. He went to Columbia with a scholarship from the Maharaja of Baroda, and so on. So Ambedkar, and then thereafter, after coming back from Columbia and his law studies in the United Kingdom, when he returned to India, he joined Indian politics and became the one of the founding people of the modern post-colonial Indian nation state. So Ambedkar and Dewey are also very different thinkers in many ways. Now, notwithstanding these sort of caveats and disclaimers, let me also give you another biographical note. and again, this is something that will help you contextualize some of the things that I'm going to discuss today. Um, if you look at the title of this talk, I have mentioned only two thinkers there, Dewey and Ambedkar. But the talk this evening will also include references to two other very important philosophers and thinkers, and a reference to a very important text. These two other thinkers are A. Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher. I'm sure all of you are familiar with his name. And the fourth thinker in the list is Leo Trotsky. Again, a familiar name, but a name that a thinker who is not properly studied even by many ardent Marxists, right? Because of his differences with Stalin, there are different branches of Marxist uh, uh, politics that do not adequately engage with Trotsky. So that's another problem there. And my very dear friend Kunal Chattopadhyay from Comparative Literature Department of Jadavpur University is a better person to give you an idea of how Trotsky is even neglected even by the Marxists. So then Trotsky is the fourth figure in the list, and the important text that I'm going to refer to is Mahabharata, right? Especially the episode that we come across in the Bhagavad Gita, the Kurukshetra battle, right? That's where we will locate the question of violence. So these are the four thinkers that we are going to discuss, and primarily among these four, we will focus on Ambedkar and Dewey. In fact, it is through Dewey and Ambedkar that we'll encounter Russell and Leo Trotsky. But this is not the biographical note as such. The biographical note that you need to know in order to sort of make these connections that I'm going to share with you in the next few minutes is the fact that there was a direct meeting that happened between Trotsky and Dewey. Not many people know about it. Not many people talk about it. Even Trotsky specialists have not adequately discussed this or explored this particular area. And I'm referring to an episode that unfolded in the Mexico City in 1930s, late 1930s. In 1930s, late 1930s, 1937, 38, around that time, Trotsky was living in the Mexico City. He was staying in Mexico City. He was briefly at the, he took shelter at Diego Rivera's place, the famous Mexican Marxist leftist activist and painter. And thereafter, he had an affair with his wife, Frida Kahlo. And, you can guess how he was thrown out of Diego Rivera's house. And then eventually, Stalin's police chased him to the Mexico City, and he was brutally attacked. Just before he got attacked, his son, Leon Sidov, was attacked and killed by Stalin's police. And Trotsky received a fatal blow from those police officers on the streets of Mexico City, and eventually he passed away in 1939, if I'm not too wrong about the dates. But what is more important here is that before that assassination of Trotsky, before that killing of Trotsky that happened in late 1930s, Trotsky was put on trial by Mexico, and that trial is known as the Mexico trial of Leo Trotsky. Those of you who have some idea about Trotsky's life, you can also watch this very interesting. I'm not sure whether it's a very nuanced kind of narrative, but those of you who are interested to know more about Trotsky can just log in Netflix account into your Netflix account and have a look at and watch this web series called Trotsky. Those of you who know a little bit about Trotsky's life, I'm sure they know that there was a Moscow trial against Trotsky. These were basically allegations against Trotsky made by Stalin that were being investigated in the Moscow trial. And again, when he was caught in Mexico, he was put on trial. Now, one interesting information that I am impatient to share with all of you is that the Mexico trial was chaired by none other than John Dewey. A lot of people actually dissuaded Dewey from joining the Moscow trial of Trotsky. They didn't want him to chair those sessions of Moscow trials on Trotsky. But Dewey was very committed to these issues, and the question of social justice especially, wanted to take up the challenge because there could be life threats from Stalin and so on. So despite those things, he accepted the invitation to chair those sessions of Moscow trials, and eventually he concluded this Moscow trial, chaired by John Dewey, concluded that Trotsky was not guilty. In fact, they came up with a report, a final report, that looked into those, allegations made by Stalin against Trotsky, that got a title, very interesting title called "Not Found Guilty," right? So it's actually a book now. If you Google it, you will get to see what I'm referring to. Right? So these are the two important biographical notes with which I begin. Now, let me also share with you the schema of this presentation today, because without the schema, you might be misguided. You might not be able to follow the intricacies of some of the arguments that I'm going to make. The first set of arguments will revolve around two of Ambedkar's texts. It's better to go by some texts. That is always a convenient strategy. So I'll talk about two important texts by Ambedkar. One is his 1956 text. Ambedkar passed away in 1956, and just before his death, he delivered a lecture, which later got published in the collected writings of and speeches of Ambedkar, published by Maharashtra government. It's called Buddha or Karl Marx. This is a text wherein Ambedkar tries to think through the relative, the comparative. It's a comparison between Buddhist philosophy and Marxist thought, and he is basically trying to argue that Buddhism is his preferred path. That is not to say simply that Marxism is not a good path. Marxism is not a path that he likes. He certainly likes it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bothered to compare it with Buddhism, something which is very close to his heart, something that is very close to his intellectual orientation as well. So it's not to simply suggest, and I'm saying this because there is an anxiety here. The anxiety is that a lot of people have actually tried to represent Ambedkar as somebody who has always been against Marxists. I don't think he was, deadly opposed, as it were, to any Marxist leftist thought. He certainly considered Marxism as an important intellectual presence. If you look at some of his other writings, you realize what I'm trying to refer to here. So it's not that he didn't like Marxism, but for him, it's important to follow the path of Buddhism rather than Marxism. And why is that so? The answer is being explored in this text, Buddha or Karl Marx. As I said, this was a speech delivered in 1956. So you can look at this particular text as the first point for the kind of discussions that we're going to have now on the question of himsa, ahimsa, violence, etc. The second text by Ambedkar that we're going to discuss briefly is a review article that Ambedkar wrote in the Journal of Indian Economic Society. This was an earlier article. This was published in 1918, if I'm not wrong. In this article, this is a review article of Bertrand Russell's book, Philosophy of Social Reconstruction, or Why Men Fight. It's the same book, Why Men Fight, Philosophy of Social Reconstruction, published under these two different titles in the United States and the United Kingdom. And this is a text that's written to think through the concerns that got raised because of the colossal violence of the First World War. And many global thinkers of that time were, including Tagore and Gandhi in India, or Russell in the United Kingdom, Dewey in the United States. A lot of thinkers were actually thinking about why men fight with each other, why nation states fight with each other. And they were all, they were all intrigued by, as well as disturbed by, the kind of violence that happened, that constituted the First World War. And within a span of another decade, we'll actually have another, within a span of 1.5 decades or 2 decades, we'll have another world war in the middle of the 20th century. So Russell wrote this book to think why people fight with each other, why nation states fight with each other. And this is a review of that book, the review article by Ambedkar, that was published in 1918 in the Indian Economic, in the Journal of the Indian Economic Society. These are the two texts with which we'll begin, and then these texts will lead us to another text by Leo Trotsky. Trotsky's text was written around that time of Mexico trial of Trotsky, chaired by John Dewey. And this particular text, I'll give you the title of this text. It's called Our Morals and Theirs. Our Morals, as in moral principles, our morals and theirs. If you are interested to look at the text of this particular essay, look at the content of this text, you can simply visit Marxist.org and type Leo Trotsky, and you'll be led to this essay. It's there on Marxist.org website. Perhaps not the complete text, but certainly some important excerpts from that text are available on Marxist.org. Now, in 1938, Trotsky wrote this text in a journal called the New International. It was an American journal based in the New York City. In 1938, it was a journal published by Marxist, leftist thinkers, activists, politicians of that time in the United States. And the New International, I'm being told, is still in circulation in the United States, but I'm not too sure about its sort of outreach. But it's something that still exists, I'm told. And in 1938, this particular text that Trotsky wrote in the New International provoked John Dewey to respond to this text. And this is the text that we will refer to while talking about the two texts that I mentioned, the text by Ambedkar that I mentioned. Right. Let me now get back to the first two texts, and then by Ambedkar, and then we will proceed to discuss Dewey's text. Now, if you go through Buddha or Karl Marx, there are important concerns that Ambedkar raises there against or about Marxist ideologies. I do not want to imply that there is a monolithic or monolithized Marxist ideology as such, because that's something that does not exist. And for anyone who has been interested in Marxism, this is just mere common sense. So I categorically mention it as Marxist ideologies. That's to say that there might be a plethora of different views and ideas and ideologies within the broader template of Marxism. Now, having said that, Ambedkar is trying to discuss, as I have already said, is trying to discuss the efficacies of Marxist philosophies, Marxist thoughts, and then comparing them with the Buddhist thoughts. And then thereafter, he concludes that for him, it's Buddhism that is to be followed as a more effective path for both individual liberation, individual emancipation, and for social emancipation as well, right? But among these concerns that Ambedkar has about Marxism or against Marxism, if you like, there is a central concern. The central concern is the question of violence, or to put it more categorically, he is concerned about the question of violence in revolutionary politics. How should we deploy violence if we are to bring about a social revolution, or any kind of revolution for that matter? Is it okay? Is it justifiable? Is it approved to deploy violence in order to bring about socio-political cultural revolutions, especially socio-political revolutions? And he says that for the Marxists, the deployment of violence is almost a necessary requirement, almost an inevitable element that comes out, that emerges out of class conflicts between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and so on. So if there is a class conflict in any given society, violence is an inevitable outcome. And if there has to be something like the dictatorship of the proletariat, then violence is something that is unavoidable, that is inevitable. So in other words, violence, according to Ambedkar's readings of Marxist thought, especially that of Trotsky, deployment of violence is absolutely necessary. In fact, it is inevitable, unavoidable. This is something that Ambedkar is not okay with. Not to simply imply that Ambedkar is the champion of non-violence in a typical Gandhian fashion. Certainly not, far from it. And I'll have further occasions to discuss that. So what exactly is Ambedkar's opinions on the Marxist deployment of violence in bringing about social revolution then? That is the moot question here. We'll stay with this question. We'll discuss this as briefly as I can. But it is also important to see that in the other text that I mentioned, that I have already promised to discuss, that is the review article of Bertrand Russell's book, Philosophy of Social Reconstruction, published in 1918 in the Indian Journal of the Indian Economic Society. That in that text, if you read that text, that was published in 1918, right? Not in 1956, Buddha or Karl Marx. In 1918 text, please note that this is something that happens much before, almost 2 decades before the debate that happens on the pages of the New International Journal between Trotsky and Dewey. So I'm not simply suggesting that Ambedkar directly derived from that debate, or Ambedkar had a direct knowledge of that debate in the New International between Dewey and Trotsky. That could be the case, that might not be the case, we don't know, we are not sure. But what is important in this context is that there is a great deal of similarity between the arguments that Ambedkar is putting forward in that 1918 review article on Russell's book, Philosophy of Social Reconstruction, and some of the distinctions some of the ideas that he coins there, he plays with, he explores there in that review article, and some of the things that Dewey had to offer in that 1938 debate that Dewey had with Trotsky on the pages of the New International, within that sort of background of the Moscow trials against Trotsky, chaired by John Dewey, right? So that's the schema. So what exactly are the arguments that we come across in Buddha or Karl Marx vis-a-vis this particular question of violence? What are Ambedkar's opinions on this? Ambedkar suggests that the Buddhist idea of violence, let's use the Indic term himsa, or its opposite term ahimsa, assuming that there is a direct opposition between these two. the fine line between himsa and ahimsa is something that we are actually trying to grapple with. I'll come to that later on. But assuming for the time being that there is these are diametrically opposed terms, himsa and ahimsa, let's use these terms. So Ambedkar says that the Buddhist conception of himsa, or Buddhist conception of violence, this is very important for building up the next few arguments that I'm going to make, is not the Buddhist idea of violence is not an absolutist one. What exactly does he mean by that? This is something that we need to stay with for some time, and we'll get back to this again and again, even when I'll be referring to Mahabharata. And the second important point that we come across in that 1918 essay, the review article on Bertrand Russell's book Philosophy of Social Reconstruction, published in the Indian Economic Society Journal in 1918, is the distinction that Ambedkar draws between what he calls force as violence, or violence as violation, force as violence, and force as energy. So according to Ambedkar, force as violence is something that we need to be careful about, that we should not deploy, but force as energy is something that is very important for Ambedkar. Now, what does he exactly mean by force as energy? Ambedkar tries to imply that in every revolutionary thought, in every revolutionary politics, any kind of concern that prioritizes social equality, struggles for social equality, justice, anything like that, requires a fair amount of argumentative force. That is the force of thought. That is the force of contemplation. That is the force of persuasion. That's also the force of rhetoric. So that force, that energy, is something that Ambedkar is extremely fond of. Ambedkar says, echoing Bertrand Russell, that stasis of any kind is something that is detrimental to revolutionary politics of any kind. You can't bring about any kind of revolution if your thoughts are not energized, if your thoughts are not persuasively argued about, if your thoughts are not persuasively presented through the deployment of equally persuasive rhetoric, and so on. We must remember that Ambedkar is a lawyer, is a trained lawyer. Ambedkar was familiar with the rhetoricians like Cicero and so on. He actually quotes from Cicero in many of his texts. He deploys several different methods of argumentation, legal argumentation, in many of his writings. Some of my students who have attended my classes on Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste already know that Ambedkar deploys what I call argumentum ad absurdum in a text like Annihilation of Caste. That is to say that Ambedkar puts himself in the shoes of his opposition and shows the contradictions in his opposition's arguments in order to finally conclude that those arguments do not have any merit. So he basically proves that those arguments of his opposition in favor of the caste system are actually stupid, meaningless, absurd, right? So Ambedkar is somebody who deployed that force as energy idea in many of his writings, in many of his speeches, and he is all for it. But when it comes to force as coercive kind of violence, as a coercive force, as violation, then Ambedkar is not okay with it, right? So therefore, this distinction between force as energy and force as violation or force as violence is absolutely important for him. As much as it is important for him to recognize the fact that violence invariably is part of our lives. Some kind of violence or the other is part of our lives, part of our everyday existence. To be completely violent is not only an impossible or improbable idea, but in a very subtle philosophical fashion, he tries to hint, he tries to imply that that in itself might be tremendously violent. And one very banal example of this is the way we criticize certain food habits of particular religious communities, particular caste communities, and condemn those habits, eating habits, food habits, as violent acts. So they eat this, therefore they are violent. They kill that animal, and therefore they are violent. And we condemn that violence to such an extent that we end up killing those people who kill those animals, right? So in a sense, in many ways, the arguments in favor of non-violence, if it is taken to an absolutist extent, and if it is taken in an absolutist sense, then it might not just be an absurd proposition. It might not be just, let's say, an impossibility, even at the level of thinking, if not in lived reality, but is also capable of becoming extremely violent, more violent than those other forms of everyday unavoidable violence. Right? That is the argument that he's playing with in that text, Buddha Karl Marx, and that review article that he wrote in 1918. Buddha Karl Marx tries to suggest that Ambedkar is not, reconciled with the Marxist tendency to simply argue that violence is automatically, invariably, inevitably deduced from class conflicts. That is an a priori suggestion that since there is class difference and class antagonism, class conflict, class struggle, violence is inevitable. To spend too much time on whether we should deploy violence in bringing about the dictatorship of the proletariat, to borrow that phrase from Marxist vocabulary, or to establish socialist goal, or to borrow that phrase from Trotsky's essay, Their Morals and Ours, to have that control over nature and to free men from the clutches, the oppressive clutches, control of other men. In order to achieve these goals, that's the end. These are the ends that we need to achieve. And Ambedkar says that it is okay to have those noble ends, but to suggest that those ends are directly deduced from class struggle, and therefore the deployment of violence is also deduced from class struggle as means, the deployment of violence as a means to achieve that end, socialist end, communist end, Marxist end, whatever. In order to achieve that end, if you deploy violence, you can't simply justify, you can't stop at that point wherein you say that, deployment of violence is justified simply because there is class antagonism, simply because ultimately the goal is a noble one. In other words, to put it in more technical terms, if not philosophical terms, so to say, we can say that Ambedkar is suggesting that the deployment of violence has to be contemplated. The question of contemplation, the act of thinking through it, thinking through violence as a means to achieve a noble goal, cannot be simply kept aside, dismissed, by suggesting that it is deduced from class struggle. It's an inevitable part of class struggle. Proletariat people have been oppressed through violent methods, and therefore their opposition to, their struggle against the bourgeoisie will also invariably incorporate violence, is not a completely acceptable proposition for Ambedkar. This becomes clear when we look at the debate that happened between Trotsky and Dewey in 1938 in the pages of the New International Journal. So let's now quickly look at that debate, and then we will move on to an episode in the Mahabharata, rather two episodes in the Mahabharata. We'll briefly talk about Mahabharata. And if time permits, we can also have some discussions, especially in the question and answer session, on the idea of nationalism as something that sort of cuts across all these discussions that I'm developing here this evening. So Ambedkar, John Dewey, in that debate with Trotsky. So what does Trotsky say in that essay? Let me first summarize some of those thoughts of Trotsky. Trotsky says in that essay, Their Morals and Ours, in the New International Journal in 1938, Trotsky says, deployment of violence, this is something that I've already said, the deployment of violence in revolutionary politics is an inevitable one. It is justified because the end is a noble one, and end justifies the means. Therefore, there is no way of simply dismissing violence as something negative, as something that is not desirable when it comes to bringing about a revolutionary politics. And then Trotsky says that those who want to think too much about the question of violence actually end up moralizing the question of violence too much, and they damage the enthusiasm of the proletariat to bring about a social, political, or economic revolution. That therefore, he links the possibility of thinking about violence as a means to that noble end, socialist, Marxist, whatever end, with the question of class struggle, and then tries to justify it by saying that A, it is reduced from class struggle, and B, the end, because it is a noble end, it's a wonderful end, it's an end about social justice and equality and so on. Therefore, the end justifies these means. Now, Dewey says that it's okay. I agree with Trotsky there when he says that it is the end that ultimately, that finally justifies the means that are adopted in order to arrive at that end. But there are certain problems that Trotsky does not adequately address. What are these concerns that Dewey raises in that response to Trotsky's piece in the New International? Dewey says that even when you think that there is a particular end, and in order to achieve that particular end, you deploy violence as a means, the end in view, that is the end in view, the end that you have in your mind, that the end that you want to achieve or arrive at, that destination, that telos, that goal, might not be the actual goal when it is realized. This is very important. So he gives us two phrases there: end in view and end in reality. End in view is the end that we are assuming, we are anticipating, we are struggling towards. But when we actually go there, reach that position, that phase, that point, assuming that we can ever reach that point, the end in reality, then that end in view becomes the end in reality. Dewey says that the end in reality might not completely resemble the end in view with which we began our journey, wherein we deployed violence as a means and justified that deployment of violence as a correct method because the end in view, because the end is justifiable, the end is noble, end in view is noble. So there is a difference, there is an incongruity between end in view and end in reality. And if you do not think through this, if you do not raise concerns about this distinction, then you end up giving birth to results, ends, multiple ends that might not be very desirable, that might not be aligned with the end in view with which you began your journey, the journey of revolutionary politics, right? So there might be multiple ends. Some of those ends might be good for the main end with which you began your journey, the primary end, let us say. And some of the ends that we might give birth to in the process of deploying violence in revolutionary politics might not be very conducive for the ultimate goal, the ultimate end. Let's say the ultimate end in this case is the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the fulfillment of, let's say, the socialist goal, right? So end in reality differs from end in view. That's one. And secondly, there might be multiple ends. Even if you think that there is a particular end and you work towards it, right? You deploy violence in order to achieve that end. That is an important concern that Dewey raises there. And then he says that there is a problem here in Marxist, especially in Trotsky's thinking, in his thought. And that problem is that this is an a priori principle, where the class struggle as something that justifies the deployment of violence in revolutionary politics is something that is an a priori proposition. And it certainly does not allow one to think about the several factors that are involved in this process. The emergence of multiple ends, the differences between the possible differences that might be there between end in view with which you began your journey and the end in reality that you will actually encounter in the process, at the end of the process, at the end of the tunnel, as it were. Dewey says that my problem with Trotsky's proposition here is that I agree with Trotsky. Dewey says I agree with Trotsky when he says that ultimately, finally, in the final instance, in the last instance, as Althusser was very fond of saying again and again in many of his writings, in the last instance, it is the end that justifies the means that are adopted to arrive at that end, to achieve that end. But because there are other concerns, and I'm not repeating that, I've just narrated them for all of you, because there are other results that might be there at the end of the process, it is important for us to be able to contemplate, to think through the deployment of violence. If that possibility of thinking through the deployment of violence in revolutionary politics is negated, then that in itself becomes a problematic philosophical proposition, or even a political proposition. And Dewey has reservations about it. That is Dewey's primary. I have been somewhat reductive in narrating, describing, paraphrasing some of these thoughts. These are very complex arguments that Dewey and Trotsky make in the pages of the New International Journal. But this is in a nutshell, this is what they are trying to argue about. So again, out of this discussion, we actually come across a Deweyan distinction between force as energy and force as violence. Or we realize that the deployment of violence in bringing about revolutionary politics might not always give us the anticipated, desired results. And many of us by now, we know that if you look at the Marxist world, that has been the case in many ways, many instances. That is the way we have seen Marxist politics unfolding. That is not to be simply dismissive about Marxist politics. I personally identify myself as a Marxist Ambedkarite. So I'm not suggesting that this is completely a flaw in Marxism and as such, but this is something that has to be discussed. There has to be some discursive space in order to look at these other possibilities vis-a-vis the ends that Dewey talks about, that Dewey mentions in that particular response to Trotsky. So you can see that there is a great deal of similarity between Dewey's thoughts vis-a-vis Marxism, especially the deployment of violence in revolutionary politics, and how Ambedkar thinks about these concerns in the two texts, Buddha, Karl Marx, and the review article on Barton Russell's book, Philosophy of Social Reconstruction. Now, I'm going to give you another point, and we are running out of time, so I'll conclude my lecture with that reference. And if there is some questions on nationalism and how nationalism is linked with these concerns and thoughts that I'm raising here, I'll be very happy to discuss that part as well. Um, the last part is a focus on Bhagavad Gita, or generally the Mahabharata. Ambedkar, let's again begin with Ambedkar's writings. Ambedkar wrote uh, an unfinished text. It's a short essay on the Bhagavad Gita called Krishna and his Gita. In Krishna and his Gita, Ambedkar raises several reservations about the Bhagavad Gita, and it simply doesn't matter to him. It doesn't matter whether we Hindus consider Bhagavad Gita as a sacrosanct text that cannot be questioned, that cannot be criticized or critiqued. Ambedkar's sacropolitics, to borrow that word from my friend Jimmy Casas-Clausen's essay, published in an edited volume. It's on Ambedkar's reading of the Bhagavad Gita. It's a discussion of Krishna and his Gita. It's a brilliant essay. If you are interested, I can give you the references and you can take a quick look at that essay. It's a brilliant, fascinating essay by Jimmy. But so to borrow that word from Jimmy's vocabulary, Jimmy's essay, Ambedkar's sacropolitics, Ambedkar's politics in interpreting Bhagavad Gita, Krishna and his Gita. If you look at that text, you realize that Ambedkar raises several questions about Bhagavad Gita and explains why he doesn't consider Bhagavad Gita as a brilliant philosophical text in the way many Hindus tend to consider it. Ambedkar says that Bhagavad Gita is a text that upholds Varnashram Dharma. If you go through Gita as a student of Ramakrishna Mission school, and there are Ramakrishna Mission College at Belur Math, I have read the Bhagavad Gita almost on an everyday basis. I have been reading the Bhagavad Gita. Now, for the last 5-6 years, I haven't been reading it, but for a long time, I was a regular reader of the Bhagavad Gita. If you read the Bhagavad Gita, you realize that there are portions in the Bhagavad Gita wherein Lord Krishna tries to, in some sense, justify the Varnashram Dharma. He says that the Varnas, the Chaturvarna system, has been created by me. That's what Krishna says to Arjuna. And says that this has been created by me, not simply because, it's something like a bad, sort of social custom that I want to establish and uphold and perpetuate. But because I think that Varna system is based on a justifiable principle of quality or guna, right? So Krishna there gives us the guna theory of Varna system. That is to say that each Varna becomes what it is because of some innate principle, innate guna, quality, whatever you want to call it. And this is, according to Ambedkar's reading of the Bhagavad Gita, especially this part of the Bhagavad Gita, this is a twisted extrapolation. It's a twisted reading of, or an extrapolation from Shankhokarika, Shankhodarshan, Shankho philosophy. If you read Gauradeva's Shankhokarika, you realize that Shankhodarshan gives us the three gunas, Sattva, Rajo, and Tamo. And Krishna says that my creation of the Varnashram Dharma, or the Varnashram system, is actually based on the three gunas. Now, Ambedkar gives us a mathematical question there. He says, agreed that there are three gunas, and on the basis of that, there are Varnas. So, Brahmin might be Sattvic, Kshatriya might be Rajasic, and so on. Excuse me. But how is it that there are three gunas and only four varnas, and there are only three gunas and there are four varnas? So there is a mathematical mismatch there. But let's not get into that. There are other ways of looking at it. The other question. So one problem that Ambedkar has with the Bhagavad Gita is the question of how Krishna upholds Varnashram Dharma. The other problem that he has with the text is that there is a legitimization of violence in Bhagavad Gita. So Ambedkar says that it's an extremely violent text. I simply don't understand why Hindus tend to project it as, or for that matter, project themselves as, non-violent community, as an ahimsavadi community, and so on. Because ultimately, Bhagavad Gita is an extremely violent text. That is his polemical attack on the Bhagavad Gita. Now, whether you agree with that reading or not, it doesn't really matter in this context of my lecture today. But the most interesting part of these readings, these polemical attacks that Ambedkar mounts on the Bhagavad Gita, the text of the Bhagavad Gita, the sacrosanct sacred text of the Hindus, is the way he raises the question of violence. That is what I'm more concerned with. And when I talk about the question of violence, I have to not only just look at the Bhagavad Gita, but also need to look at the text of the Mahabharata and other episodes in the Mahabharata, especially one particular episode, Aranyak Parva. If you look at Ambedkar's Krishna and his Gita, Ambedkar says that apart from upholding Varnashram Dharma, Gita is a violent text because ultimately Krishna is suggesting that Arjuna should kill his kith and kin because it is, and this is very important, because it is his Varna duty. He is a Kshatriya, it is his duty. It's almost like your professional duty. It's your duty to participate in war and kill. That's what you are supposed to do. So go ahead, do it. Don't think too much about it. Right? And for many reasons, this is something that reminds me of Eichmann. Eichmann was an officer, a Nazi officer in Hitler's regime, who managed a lot of killing of Jews. And when there was a trial of Eichmann, you can read Hannah Arendt's text on Eichmann. When Eichmann was put on trial, when he was asked why he killed so many people, he said, that was my duty. That was my official job. That was my professional duty to order killing, to go and kill people, to manage killing of Jews. That's what I was supposed to do. So I did it. Why should I be put on trial just because I performed my official duty? So this call of duty, this official duty, is analogous to the Varnashram's call for duty, right? It is, you are a Kshatriya, it's your duty to kill. Don't think. You are a Shudra, it's your duty to serve the three Varnas, the upper three Varnas. So do that. Don't think, don't question. Right? That, if you are a Vaishya, it's your duty to conduct trade, do business, and that is what you will do. Don't question. So there is a negation of thinking there. Please now quickly, get back to my earlier references to Marxism and how it negates thinking, especially when it comes to deployment of violence in revolutionary politics. So again, in a very ironical, interesting way, even when it comes to religious orthodoxy of whatever kind, whatever religious orientation, you realize that there is a negation of thinking. It's not just mere exercise of rationalism, but it's just the possibility of thinking. That is negated in this context by raising the Varna duty idea, that it is your, Arjuna, it is your duty to kill. It's your duty to, participate in a war and do what you are supposed to do. Why are you thinking? Why are you confused? Because Arjuna is suffering from some kind of philosophical, moral confusion there. He has to kill his own guru and his own kith and kin. The Kauravas are his own brothers, cousins. So how can he kill them? He's flustered, he's confused, he's completely at a loss. And at that moment, Krishna comes in as his moral guide, as it were, and says that you do your duty, you perform your Varna duty. That's what he was supposed to do. And remember, and Gayatri Sivak has talked about this in some of her texts. If you look at, especially while discussing that famous short story by Mahashita Devi, Draupadi, if you look at the preface that Sivak writes to the translation of Draupadi by Mahashita Devi, you'll come across references to this, that the war of Kurukshetra, one of the primary concerns of Arjuna at that moment in the Kurukshetra war was to think of the possibility of a hypothetical scenario wherein everybody, Kauravas and Pandavas, have died. What would happen to the women of their communities, their families? They will be impregnated by other people belonging to some dubious social background, and thereby will give birth to Varna Shankara, hybrid, hodgepodge caste, mishmash men and women. And therefore, the Varna structure will collapse. Varnashram duty or the caste system, Varna system, has got a lot to do with sexual choices, sexual habits, sexual relationships. So Arjuna is actually quite worried about it. If you read these texts, you realize that. But I'll not get into that. That's not what we're discussing today. What is more important here is this negation of the possibility of thinking violence, thinking about violence, whether we should go ahead and deploy violence, whether we should go ahead and kill people. That negation of thinking about that deployment of violence is something that we also come across because of the Varna system that Krishna unfolds in the Bhagavad Gita. But interestingly enough, when it comes to Mahabharata, you have too many narratives, too many perspectives, constantly clashing with each other, contradicting each other, complementing each other, giving us important, ironical insights in the process. So in Aranyok Parva, you come across a very interesting conversation between Yudhishthir and Dharma. Dharma asks Yudhishthir, what is the best principle in life? And Yudhishthir says, Anishangsha is the best principle in life. Look at that term, Anishangsha, non-cruelty, leniency. It's not non-violence. We are more familiar with that phrase, that line. Non-violence is the best principle. Ahimsa paramadharma. Yudhishthira, on the contrary, says, interestingly, that Anishangsha paramadharma, not ahimsa paramadharma, Anishangsha paramadharma. Now, that means, if you look at that episode in the Mahabharata, Aranyok Parva, that conversation between Yudhishthira and Dharma, you realize that this is something that is in continuation with an earlier statement made by Vyadrupi Dharma, Dharma Vyad. Dharma Vyad, in that episode, comes up with this proposition that violence in its absolutist form is an impossibility. Remember that Dharma Vyad is a Vyad, a person with so-called low social background, who sells meat in the market after killing some animals, the meat of dead animals. So his life is a life of violence. And he says that life of violence is an inevitable one. I have to do it in order to survive. But, so violence in its absolutist form is not a realistic possibility. It's not a prudential idea. What we might, however, try to do is to avoid violence as violation, or what he calls cruelty. So becoming or being Anishangsha is a better principle than this extremely impractical proposition of ahimsa paramadharma. Right? So in the Mahabharata, even when you have some episode like the Kurukshetra war, wherein Krishna is justifying deployment of violence because ultimately it's Arjuna's duty to kill people because he is a Kshatriya, that's his Varna duty, that is his official duty, echoing some of the things that Eichmann had to say during his trials after the fall of Nazi Germany. Despite all of that, in the same text in Aranyok Parva, you have a voice like that of Yudhishthir, or before Yudhishthir, like that of Dharma Vyad, wherein we come across an idea of violence, a discussion on violence and non-violence, himsa and ahimsa, or non-cruelty, anishangsha. That's the term that we come across in the Mahabharata. That is similar to some of the insights that we have already discussed in Ambedkar's writings, in Dewey's writings. So when it comes to the question of violence and how Ambedkar thought through these concerns and questions, we must realize that Ambedkar is drawing distinctions between force as energy and force as violence, in the sense that violence is violation, coercion. It kills people for the sake of killing, and there is a negation of thinking. There is no chance. There is a foreclosure. There is no scope for thinking about whether we should deploy violence or not. And that concern is then applied by both Dewey and Ambedkar. This is something that you also come across in Dewey, as I have already explained. These are concerns that then are deployed by both Dewey and Ambedkar in being critical about the deployment of violence in Marxist revolutionary politics on one hand, and religious orthodoxy, or the orthodoxy of the Varnashram system within the Hindu religious, socio-religious ethos. And you come across these insights when you explore Ambedkar's Buddha and or Karl Marx, the review article on Barton Russell's book Philosophy of Social Reconstruction, or when you look at Dewey's debate with Trotsky in the pages of the New International Journal in 1930s, just before Trotsky's death, just before his assassination. And then when you look at Ambedkar's readings of the Krishna and his Gita, and our readings, especially readings of Shivaji Bandyopadhyay in a book called Three Essays on the Mahabharata, if you look at those readings of the Mahabharata, then you realize that Ambedkar's propositions vis-a-vis violence, non-violence, and force as violence, force as energy, those ideas to a great extent echo some of the interesting philosophical insights that Dharmabad has to offer in the Aranyok Parva of the Mahabharata. Thank you. If you have questions, please go ahead. Tanmoy? Hello?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Kalyan Kumar Dash, for this wonderful academic discourse. And now I think it's time for taking questions.
Yeah. Okay, Devabruto has sent a question. Does ideology or ideological discourse precede the various texts of violence across history, society, culture somewhere for violence to create the desired impact, whether positive or negative? I'm not exactly sure whether what you want to imply or what you are trying to convey through that question, because it looks somewhat convoluted for me. But I think I have made myself sufficiently clear. I'm suggesting that uh, the presence of violence might be unavoidable at times, and then that is an argument that's also often offered in defense of the episode in the Bhagavad Gita, the Kurukshetra war, and the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. But I'm aware of it. I'm aware of those readings of the conversations between Arjuna and Krishna. But what I'm suggesting, echoing Ambedkar and Dewey and Dharmabad in the Mahabharata's Aranyok Parva, what I'm suggesting is that even if we agree that violence is unavoidable, and to some extent or the other, violence is something that is always there, and we have to give up on some kind of extremist idea of non-violence, an absolutist idea of non-violence or violence, something that is, somewhat akin to the Jaina conception of violence. You have to be completely non-violent, and that's an impossibility. And anybody with a pragmatic bent of mind would say that that's an impossibility. So, in that case, I think it becomes very important for us to be able to think whether we can deploy violence, even if the target is a noble one, even if the goal is a noble one. So these texts actually give us some insights on that, whether we should violence or before we deploy it. There has to be some scope in order to think through the deployment of violence, the possibility of deploying violence in doing whatever politics, whatever social revolution or change you want to bring about. Okay, Shoikot has another question. Do you consider translation of a particular text also endorses violence to people on the fringes of history? Example, Hoare and Smith's translation of prison notebooks by Gramsci. Yes, in many cases, translation itself is a I won't say it endorses violence, but it is a process through which some violence, uh, either deliberately or inadvertently, uh, happens. Translation might be a very violent process, and yeah, I think you are quite right that uh, that is why I completely agree with Spivak's concerns there when she says that translation is a continuous project, which is why she decided to come up with another translation of Jacques Derrida's De la Grammatologie, of Grammatology, recently published by Siegel. So I completely sort of agree with that. Yeah, translation of a particular text also gives birth to violence, either deliberately or inadvertently. But I don't think it directly endorses violence. Endorsement is a different kind of word. Yeah. Any other question? Anurna has a question. Anurna also attended my my last web lecture, my first web lecture actually. And she also had an interesting question there. So what is this question now? Do you think that Gandhi's journey in revolutionary politics, his end in view of India as an independent country, did not match in reality with India's map being mercilessly butchered? Okay, this is a very loaded question. It has got too many concerns there. India's map being mercilessly butchered, I'm not too sure about that nationalist anxiety. So I will sort of choose not to address that phrase in the context of my talk today. But Gandhi's journey in revolutionary politics, his end in view of India as an independent country, did not match the end in reality. Yes, to a great extent, yes, because end in reality is quite different from the kind of India that Gandhi had tried to anticipate, the kind of independent India that Gandhi had tried to uh, conceive of. So, yeah, there is certainly a huge gap, perhaps, between end in view of India as Gandhi had thought about it and in the end in reality that we all live in, that we all live with. Yeah. Any other question? I'm not too sure about this. What exactly this question is trying to convey. How do you relate to the role of Lord Krishna in the Mahabharata and his decision to not use any weapons in the Great War? Well, so you want me to comment on the fact that he himself did not, directly participate in the war? I don't think that's really an important question in the context of my talk today. Uh, this is perhaps not the right platform to discuss this. But if you want, I can, talk about it later on. तुम मुझे खून दो मैं तुम्हें आज़ादी दूंगा. Is it violence in its absolutist form, or is it violence with a purpose? That's not within the scope of my research or my talk this evening, because I am not somebody who works on Subhash Chandra Bose's ideas and concepts and thoughts. My father does. Probably my father is a better person to comment on that. But I don't work on Bose. I work on Ambedkar, and I choose to be specific to Ambedkar, restrict my views to just Ambedkar. No, I don't think, Shushmita, there has to be a non-violent response to this, or just a violent response to this. Just a couple of days ago, we actually saw a couple being lynched and tortured by Madhya Pradesh police. We don't know the technical details, the factual details of that incident, but from the look of it, from the appearance of how that video was was telecast on different news platforms, we can say that it's something that we all live with. This violence on lynching of Dalits, lynching of religious minorities, other ethnic minority groups is a kind of daily occurrence these days. So there is certainly a connection between that sort of those events of lynchings and everyday tortures and brutalities on Dalits and other communities that have been stigmatized in course of our history, and the systemic violence that is upheld and that is executed, that is legitimized through the Varna system. There is certainly a connection between these two, but and this is not rocket science. You can immediately understand that there is a huge connection between these two things. But I'm not too sure about an ideal approach. Who am I to speak about an ideal approach? If you read my Dewey Studies article that talks about the question of violence in the Mahabharata and most of the things that I discussed today, you'll realize that my article is also an open-ended article. I'm not simply suggesting that Ambedkar's readings of Marxism is an exhaustive reading or an entirely correct reading, nor am I suggesting that that Marxist critiques of liberalism, liberal moralism, is completely based on false premises. I'm not suggesting any such absolutist thing. I'm simply playing with certain ideas and readings that have emerged as I started exploring these texts. Any other question?
So thank you. So thank you so much, Professor Kalyan Kumar Das, for such a brilliant and engaging session. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you. So now as we are, and thank you to all the participants also who has been watching this program. And now as we are at the end of our session, I think I would like to request one of our students from Midnapore College, Anubhav De, to please give the formal vote of thanks.
Hello,
Over to
sir.
you, Anubhav.
Am I audible, sir?
Hello, Anubhav. Yes, audible.
Am I audible?
To me, at least.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you are.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
I, on behalf of the Department of English, Midnapore College, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to the resource person, Professor Kalyan Kumar Das, for such an informative lecture. I also thank the principal of our college, Dr. Gopal Chandra Bera, for giving us the permission for this online lecture series. I would like to convey my gratitude to our respected HOD, Professor Tanmoy Kundu, sir, who has made this online lecture series come true. At last but not the least, I would like to thank all the students who have participated in this online lecture series from all around this online lecture series. A great success. Thank you.
Thank you, Anubhav.
Thank you, Anubhav. Thank you, Anubhav. So, what I think
Thank you, Tanmoy.
that
It was a pleasure.
every time when I listen to you, and last time you also talked on Ambedkar. So every time it seems to me that
Yes.
I know less about Ambedkar. So there are more things to know. So after listening to it seems to me every time that I have to know much about more about Ambedkar. So thank you, Kalyan,
So do I
for
have
giving
to.
this
You
time.
know, I have to learn a lot
Yes.
about Ambedkar's thoughts as well, and I'm yet to
Thank you
explore
very
many of
much.
his thoughts.
Yes. Thank you very much for giving us this time, and I think Midnapore College and Department of English particularly feels honored to have you in this platform. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Tanmoy.